Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you one of my art journal pages and the process of creating this beautiful page. The intent for this page was to keep it fairly lighthearted and just to capture a few memories I had from this summer. I'll be using a variety of paper, acrylic paint, stencils, and mediums for this project. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do on this project is decide on our focal images. In this case, I'm using the Well Whisper Designs Pour Decisions paper pack for this. They actually had a piece of paper that had all of these fun little cocktail images on it, so I just cut them out from the background and I'm using them as my focal images. I really like these images, but the one thing I would like to do is add a little bit more shimmer and dimension to these beautiful images. So I'm going to be using a range of mediums. I have some glossy accents, some crackle accents, and as well I might try a little bit of this glass bead gel. You want things that are either like a glossy dimensional medium or glass bead gel. You don't want to use any sort of paste, you want to use gels because they will dry clear. I'm going to start with this little cocktail glass because there's a lot of things going on in here. I'm just going to use some glossy accents because it's going to make everything a little bit more shimmery and a little bit more shiny. And the reason that we're doing this first is this will take a little bit of time to dry. So while we're working on the rest of our page, this can do its thing. And I think I'm going to try just doing the liquid inside the glass. So really anything kind of within that glass area, just to make it look like there is actually something inside of the glass. What's nice about these Ranger Glossy Accents is it's quite easy to add this. And it does dry fairly quickly. It'll take some time, so probably by the time I'm ready to apply these onto the page, they should be ready to go. And I notice this stuff is generally fairly self-leveling, so even if it feels like it's a little uneven, it should actually dry fairly evenly. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other one as well. And now I'm going to try some glass bead gel. I think I might use that on this lemonade just because it's a little bit more square. This is going to be a little bit easier to apply this way. And we'll see how this works. This is a little bit harder. If you haven't used glass bead gel before, you might find this a little bit challenging. I do a fair amount of palette work with the palette knife, so I think I'll be able to do this without too much trouble. If you find this challenging, just stick with some of the mediums that maybe have an applicator that make it a little bit easier to apply. And again, this is going to dry clear, so in the end it's going to look amazing, but right now it does look a little cloudy. And you just want to go with your palette knife. You want to use a really small palette knife for this and just go in small areas, add a little bit at a time. And you always want to add it to the back of your palette knife like this and apply it. Working with a palette knife isn't always the easiest thing. It's just a practice thing. I actually ended up taking a palette painting class and did probably a 4-foot by 2.5-foot canvas, and by the time I had finished using a palette knife for about 10 hours, I got a little bit better practiced with it. So definitely something I'm still continuing to work on as I'm working on my creative practice, but I have to say that practice makes perfect really with a lot of these things, whether or not you're using brushes or anything, brushes, palette knives, even some of your markers and everything. It takes a little bit of time to really learn to control them. And again, I have a little bit more going on there than I want, so because you can end up kind of glopping it on if you're not careful. So I'm trying to keep this about a few beads thick, and because it will dry clear, if it isn't perfect, it's really not that big of a deal. You'll just have shimmer maybe on a few places. Maybe you don't want to necessarily have that much shimmer. I'm going to just add a little bit of glossy accents on the whole orange. It's on part of it, so it just pops a little bit, so that rind looks a little bit brighter than everything else. Again, these are little touches. It's just meant to add just a little bit of shine and fun to these paper pieces. And lastly, I'm going to use some of the Ranger Crackle accents just to add a little bit to these ones as well. So same process as the glossy accents. It has the nice little fine tip. You just spread it across in a thin layer all the way along your glass. And then once these dry, we'll be able to add them to our page. So I'm going to do both of these, and then we will move on to the next step. So now we're going to start with adding some color to our background for this art journal page. So I usually start with adding just a silicone sheet in behind my art journal page. That kind of keeps the other pages clean. I generally end up getting a little bit of bleed through on the other sides of my journal. I don't particularly care, but if this matters to you, try to protect it as well as you can. With this one, I'm actually going to be starting to use some India ink and laying down a little bit of India ink on this page. If you're interested in learning how I use ink as adding a background to some of my art journal pages, I do have a video that I have referenced above for how I incorporate it. So basically we're just adding a little bit of ink to this page. Probably don't need to add quite as much water as I did. So this take me a little bit longer to dry the page, but that's okay. I'm also going to add a little bit of the teal. Actually, I want this to kind of go from yellow, blue, and make it a little bit green. So I'm going to just let those colors meld a little bit. And in that case, I actually sprayed where I wanted it to go. And again, the ink will always move to where there's more water. So that's one thing to realize if you're trying to get certain looks and you're having trouble, just spritz the water where you want things to go and it will follow. And try not to have a lot of pooling ink on this page. So that has a fair amount of water on it. So I'm just going to use my heat tool to dry it and before we move on to the next step. So now that this is fully dry, you'll notice we now have a bit of a soft watercolor feel to this background. I was trying not to cover up all the white. I'm trying to learn to use a little bit more white space in my art journal pieces. I find that I tend to stick with those middle values. I'm trying to extend it from dark to light and having more values in there. So this is my attempt. We'll see if I actually manage to keep more of the white as we go on and add more layers. So now we're going to start adding some stencils on top with some paint. I have this Disjointed stencil and this Circlet stencil, both from Wild Whisper Designs. And I like this one because it's going to fill in some color, but it's also going to leave some areas just more white or with the color in behind. And so I think what I'm going to do with this is have a little bit more of this stencil on top and a little bit more of this one below. And this is where you can decide if you want to have more open stencils or less open stencils to kind of give this the feel that you want a little bit more. So by using a more open stencil or closed stencil in places, it gives you a different look to your page. I'm just going to be using some of this Calypso paper artsy paint on this, and I'm going to try to not have it be too thick. This is a fairly opaque paint, so sometimes I like adding a little bit of water just to thin it out a little bit before adding it through my stencil. And I'm just going to grab just a sponge, and again, these sponges I always clean them in between applications, so should maybe not gone quite that thin. I don't want this to be seeping through my stencil, but I just didn't want it to be quite as thick. So some of this is figuring out that balance between adding a lot of color and just maybe going gentler when you're adding stuff through your stencil. So as you can see, it's a very, very opaque paint. And I'm going to try to maybe just dab it a little bit lighter in some areas. And because this Disjointed stencil is quite thin and flippy, and there you can see I'm actually managing that okay. You want to make sure that you dab down instead of going in a circular motion. Stencil moved a little bit, but that's okay. And actually by thinning this paint a little bit, it seems to be working a bit better for me. This paint isn't as translucent as I had hoped. But I think what I'll end up doing is actually going in with a little bit of, maybe I'll go in for some Mermaid Lagoon. brighten that in a few places and blend it a little bit in with the color below. So I realized that I had actually planned to start with yellow on the top, not blue. So I'm now going to try to add some yellow on top and kind of see how that goes. I had planned to keep the sky a little bit lighter. It's not really sky, but more the top of my page I wanted to try to keep a little bit lighter. Let's see how this goes. There we go. And so then that's a way you can also kind of adjust your color. You can add a little bit of yellow, you can mute things a bit. And I should have probably grabbed a new sponge if I wanted it to be really true, but I don't actually mind that it's maybe not as true as it could be. I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. It's a little bit more a different direction than I was originally planning on going, but I'm really happy with it. And I think I'm going to add just a little bit of these circles on the bottom as well. And maybe to try to match that a little bit better, I'm going to actually use a little bit of this fossilized amber, and I'm using a clean sponge. Try to pull a little bit more of that yellow back in. And I actually might even throw in a little bit of this green gold color. This is a golden fluid acrylic, so I need to be a little bit more careful with this one. It has a little bit more high flow to it, so it's not what I usually use for stenciling. But we'll give it a try. So this one's a little bit easier because it's a little bit of a stiffer stencil. You can kind of rub, and then that way too, you're going on a little bit softer. And it's not going to be quite as opaque because I love some of the bottom color that I put in. I don't want to remove all of it. And then maybe come back in with a little bit of the stencil on top. Pull in a little bit more of that blue. I'll show another clean sponge for this one. I am mixing colors a little bit more, and some of these colors are not colors I usually use together, so this has been kind of an interesting experiment. There we go. Let's get a little bit more of the true color. It's getting a little bit muddy there. That you don't notice quite as much, but it still brings in a bit of a different feel to this. I think I'm just going to add some more Mermaid Lagoon here, actually. Gone a little bit muddy in this corner. See what I can do to try to I'm also using my sponge like a bit of a mark making tool, so sometimes pulling it across more and doing different things just to try to get a different variation of color in here. And it's a different way of making marks. You don't want everything looking exactly the same, so I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's lots of color. I probably took that a little bit further than I needed to, but that's okay. This is the fun thing about playing around with paint and stencils, is just experimenting and see what you kind of come up with. So you just want to let this fully dry before we move on to the next step. So once this is dry, you want to decide what you want to add on next. In this case, I'm focusing on the idea of hot sunny days. That's what this page is about. Sometimes you want more serious art journal pages as I'm working through things in my life, but sometimes it's fun to do something that's just kind of fun and light. And so in this case, I decided to basically just use my brother's scan and cut and just cut out a circle. I'm adding shapes that look a bit like a sun, and I'm going to be using this as kind of the basis of this art journaling project. So the idea of the drinks and the sun and the idea of these hot summer days, they don't last very long, so we might as well remember them, enjoy them, and focus on them when we can. And it's been a hot summer. This is the hottest summer that I can ever remember, actually. And it's been hot. There's been a lot of smoke from forest fires, and it's been a lot. It's been a beautiful summer. I'm glad that we've been able to get outside and enjoy it, especially coming out of the whole COVID season. But I have to say, it's not been cool, that's for sure. So I've been having quite a few hot drinks throughout my days. So I just wanted to focus on the idea of the hot summer days in this particular layout. So for the sun itself, I basically just used my Brother Scan and Cut just to make some shapes. And then for the summer days, and I actually have some, the word hot here. I stamped in a couple colors. This is what I usually do, is I usually stamp things in more than one color. That way I can choose which one looks best for my layout. And because I have a Brother Scan and Cut and I don't have to fussy cut all these things, it's really easy. So the hot itself is being used using the Road Trip Well Whisper stamp set. And then the brush letters were used for the summer days. And I used Mermaid Lagoon for this, which is the same blue that we have in the background there. And this yellow is the same yellow that we used below as well, the fossilized amber. So I'm just trying to decide which, that blends in a bit too much. It blends in more. I'm thinking I'm going to maybe stick with the yellow and then maybe find a way to add some ink and a pen to make this a little bit more vibrant than it is right now. And so then I will actually add in my drinks once this is dry as well. So at this point, I'm just going to start just adding these to my layout and then going from there. So to here, I'm just going to be using some of this art glitter glue. I used this actually on making a book the other day, and it actually worked really well. So I'm just going to use it because it seems like it actually adheres things in place quite quickly. I'm actually going to leave the edge there a little bit loose without glue so that when I'm adding in my rays and behind, I don't have to worry about having to try to slide them in underneath while this is adhered. So you want to make sure that that's a little bit off the page. Once you've actually added the rays, you can add a little bit more glue underneath there. And so this paper itself is from Well Whisper Designs as well. It's part of Nicole Wright's new collection. I think it's called Ledger and Script, that particular collection. So she actually has all these beautiful papers that she's created from her own mixed media work. And this is what makes this interesting, is this paper, if you're not a huge mixed media artist or you're playing with it, you're not too sure where to start, having paper that maybe already has some color or some pattern on it may make your life a little bit easier. You may find that it just helps spur your creativity a little bit more. It makes you feel a little bit more confident just to add a few things on top. I know I add a lot of layers and do a lot of things, and part of that is just through my own practices, what I like to see in my work. But that doesn't mean necessarily everyone likes that same level of color and texture. I'm trying to make these a little bit more random so they seem more like rays instead of just random pieces. This is the thing, is with shapes and stuff, you don't necessarily have to have exact sunbeam shape, but sometimes by just adding in some of these shapes, it gives you the idea of a shape. And I'm not going to just leave this like this. I'm probably going to actually add some doodling and some other things on top as well. So now I'm going to go on and add a little bit of the ladders on, and then I think what I want to do is actually take a little bit of time and add a little bit of doodling and shapes to my sun, just to give it a little bit more variety. So it's not just paper just glued on. I would like to do a little bit more than that. So I want to add a little bit more doodling to my page, and I'm going to be using some of my Posca markers. If you didn't see my video from a few weeks ago where I went over paint pens and paint markers and which ones I like, definitely give that video a try. I would definitely recommend the Posca markers for adding doodling and just writing to your art. So before I start, I decided I'm going to actually try adding a little bit to this extra sample piece. This gives the idea of what is actually going to stick out really nicely against the other colors. So the black, I think, is definitely probably the one I'm going to stick with. Maybe actually the gold. I also have a gold color here. That one would actually be really nice in some areas. it's a little more subtle than the black. I also have this yellow. But again, it is also fairly close, and I want something that has a little bit more variation. So I think I can probably stick with the gold and the black for this step. And I've decided I don't like the white on this, so I'm just actually going to go around it with the black. I think I'm just going to add a bunch of random dots in there, just so it doesn't look nearly as just straight black. So I'm pretty happy with that sun. So now we're going to move on and adding the rest of our images. So I'm coming back to you a couple hours later, because one thing I didn't realize is how long it would take the glossy accents and the glass bead gel to actually finish curing. So I had done it at the beginning of the project thinking, oh, by the end it's going to be great, and it totally wasn't. So a few hours later, I would suggest if you're going to do this project, do these the night before. I'm not very patient, so I usually like doing things the night before. I come back the next day and I can kind of create and not have to worry about waiting for things to dry or having to come back. So something to be aware of when you're doing this project. But I do love how just doing the little bit of the glass part of it made these look so much shinier, and I absolutely love how the glass bead gel worked on that. It's not super even because again I was working a palette knife in a very small space, but I just love how fizzy it looks and how fun that looks, and I like that I did add that little bit of glossy accents along the lemon there to give it a little bit more of an interesting look to it. So now we want to start adding these to our page, and as I mentioned before, I had used the cursive Well Whisper stamp set to cut out summer days. And so I like this. I feel like it sticks out from the background a bit, but it still kind of is in the same colors that I've been using so far. And so now I'm going to just add a little bit of journaling just to talk a little bit about what kind of inspired this page. So with this one, again, it wasn't really a super deep topic. I loved the idea of the drinks. It reminded me of this summer. This summer has been probably one of the hottest in memory for me. Usually what we would have for 1 or 2 weeks of hot weather in a year, we've been having that all summer, which is great, but it's a little bit much sometimes. So I have spent a lot of time outside having a cold drink. So as much as that might seem like just a really small thing to talk about, the art journal is about personal expression, of sharing memories, of sharing thoughts, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all super deep or all super incredibly serious. It can be something that's kind of fun and lighthearted, and that was the whole point of this page. So I'm just going to add my journaling. So there's my finished page with the journaling. I decided to go for a little bit of the black journaling to kind of work with the black that I have here. Sometimes I like hiding my journaling. In this case, I wanted to make it a little bit more forefront and center on the page. I've started to try to date my pages as well, just so that I know when I created them and I can think back to it. One thing I did not mention earlier was that with these cups, I did do regular glossy accents, the glass bead gel, and the Crackle paste. Or the Crackle accents. And what I found with the Crackle accents is because I put it on fairly thick, I got some really big cracks and then tiny little ones along the edge. One thing to be aware of is when you're doing this, if you want the Crackle to be really fine, you need to have a really fine layer. If you want them large, you need to put it on quite thick. I don't know if I'd use that again for this. I'd probably stick more to the glossy accents and the glass bead gel because I just like how it looked in the end a little bit better. So I hope you enjoyed this project and maybe tried out a new medium or tried something new in your artistic practice. And if this seems a little overwhelming for you, maybe take one of the techniques that I shared today and try one of them. I know I do combine quite a few things in these videos, and some of that is just to show you how some of these things can work together and how you can have a really strong mixed media piece. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and provide a comment below below about what you liked about this video. If you're interested in the supply list for this project, you can see it in the description below. It's also available on my website, hopalongstudio.com. There I usually go into some extra detail about these projects, as well as having photo and written instructions for each of these projects. You can also find other content there about having a self-care habit in your own life. If you are interested in any of the Well Whispered Designs products, they should be up on their website in the next couple of weeks, this being a newer release. You can use DT Nadine at checkout to get 10% off your next order. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.